Welcome, and take a moment before anything else happens, because this story does not begin with explosions or headlines or screaming crowds. It begins with quiet, with space, with the kind of silence that lets you hear your own thoughts, the kind of silence that exists late at night when the city is still awake but emotionally asleep, and as soft guitar chords stretch through the air and ambient synths hum like distant streetlights. This film opens an invitation, not just to watch, but to listen, to feel, and to learn. Because language is not only grammar and vocabulary, language is emotion, and one of the best ways to understand English is through the real stories of people who use it to express pain, confusion, hope, and truth. People who reshape modern culture by refusing to hide what they felt. And among those voices stands Post Malone, Austin Richard Post, not as a flawless hero or a manufactured icon, but as a deeply human figure, a man caught between worlds, between genres, between confidence and vulnerability, between massive success and quiet loneliness, a voice for a generation that grew up online, emotionally exposed, searching for meaning in a loud and complicated world. The camera moves slowly through neon city nights, reflections shaking in puddles after rain, cars passing without destination, windows glowing above empty streets. And this atmosphere sets the tone. Because Post Malone's story is not sharp and aggressive, it is soft and heavy at the same time, melancholic yet warm, raw yet strangely comforting. Long before the stadium lights and chart-topping singles, there's a different image. Small-town America, wide skies, Texas suburbs where time moves slower and dreams form quietly. And here we meet Austin Post as a kid who doesn't fit neatly into one category, a kid whose life is shaped by sound before it is shaped by success, rock music echoing from speakers, country songs telling stories of loss and memory, hip-hop rhythms teaching rhythm and flow, grunge carrying emotional weight without explanation, and this mix of influences settles into him naturally, not as strategy but as identity. And we see bedrooms transformed into makeshift studios, guitars leaning against walls, notebooks filled with half-written lines, cheap microphones plugged into laptops glowing late into the night, YouTube tabs open, tutorials playing, beats looping endlessly, because for Austin music is not a plan, it is a refuge, a place where confusion feels manageable, where emotions can exist without needing permission. He doesn't look like the artist he listens to, doesn't sound exactly like any of them either, and that makes him an outsider, someone without a clear genre, without a clean image, without an obvious path forward. But that uncertainty becomes fuel, because when you don't belong anywhere, you start building your own place. The story shifts as the internet enters the frame, not as a tool but as a turning point. And one song quietly changes everything. White Iverson appears almost casually, uploaded without full awareness of what will become. And the visuals recreate that moment with glowing laptop screens in dark rooms, play counts climbing, comments appearing faster than confidence can grow, messages arriving from strangers who suddenly care. And the emotion here is not immediate joy, but disbelief, confusion, even fear, because overnight exposure is overwhelming, and success arrives before identity has time to stabilize. Post Malone becomes a name recognized by millions, while Austin is still learning who he is. And this gap between perception and reality becomes one of the central tensions of his life. And the camera moves faster now, meetings, studios, microphones hanging from ceilings, engineers adjusting levels, voices layered again and again, melodies stretched across genres, because Post Malone refuses to choose a single lane, refuses to be only a rapper, or only a pop singer, or only a rock artist. He blends styles instinctively, emotionally, not to impress but to express, and this refusal becomes a signature. Albums like Stoney arrive not as declarations of dominance, but as emotional snapshots, songs drifting between celebration and sadness, confidence and insecurity. And audiences connect because the music feels honest rather than calculated. And then Beerbongs and Bentleys explodes into culture, charts light up, festivals fill with massive crowds, hands raised, lyrics shouted back word for word. Stage lights flash in slow motion. Smoke drifts through the air, and from the outside this looks like arrival, like success achieved exactly as it should be. But the film slows again, the color palette darkens, because fame is loud but silence always follows, and the contrast becomes unavoidable. Crowded parties cut against empty hotel rooms, flashing cameras dissolve into closed doors. Alcohol pours freely while conversations grow shallow, late nights blur together. And the emotional cost of constant visibility begins to surface. Smiling becomes automatic. Performing happiness becomes expected. And privately, the pressure builds, because being seen by everyone does not mean being understood by anyone. And fame becomes a kind of noise that temporarily distracts but never heals loneliness. Instead of hiding this reality, Post Malone places it at the center of his art. And this is where vulnerability transforms into strength. Lyrics open up about heartbreak, about longing, about self-doubt, about destructive habits, and the fear of losing control. And he does this without pretending to be untouchable, without constructing an image of invincibility. His music becomes confession rather than defense, and listeners hear themselves inside it. They recognize the emotional contradictions, the desire for connection mixed with fear, the sadness that success cannot erase. And this honesty builds a bond stronger than any image could. The visuals mirror this emotional openness. Rain sliding down windows, neon lights reflected in tired eyes, handwritten lyrics appearing briefly on screen before fading, reminding us that behind the spectacle, there is always a person writing alone. As time passes, evolution becomes visible, not as reinvention but as growth. Hollywood's bleeding arrives like a city at night, beautiful, dangerous, seductive, and fragile. The sound matures, the themes deepen, awareness replaces chaos in subtle ways. Fewer masks, more reflection, and the narrative introduces the idea of balance, not as perfection but as survival, understanding that art and health must coexist if the story is going to continue. Desert highways stretch endlessly into horizon, symbolizing movement without clear destination. Neon signs flicker against darkness. Aerial cityscapes reveal how small one person can feel inside something so massive, and yet through all that Post Malone remains resistant to becoming just a symbol or a trend, because his connection with people is rooted in shared emotion, not aspiration. That connection becomes undeniable in Moment of Legacy. Stadium crowds from different cultures and backgrounds singing every word. Fans finding comfort, release, and understanding the music. And the documentary pauses here to reflect on why Post Malone resonates so deeply, because he chooses honesty over ego, emotion over image, vulnerability over performance. And in doing so, he proves that genre does not define truth, that softness can coexist with strength, and that modern masculinity can include openness without shame. The meaning of Post Malone is not found in numbers alone, but in permission. Permission to feel uncertain, to admit sadness, to exist without fitting perfectly into expectations. In the final movement, the film slows to near stillness, a lone figure walking with guitar along an empty road, sunset bleeding into night, the soundscape reduced to wind and distant traffic. And this image captures the essence of the story. Not a man who conquered everything, but a man who kept going while carrying his emotions openly. Calm visuals return, the music softens, and text appears gently on the screen. You don't have to fit in to be heard. And the closing reflection settles in. Post Malone did not just blend genres. He gave people permission to feel deeply, to be imperfect, to be honest, and to remain human in a world that often rewards noise instead of truth. And that is why his voice continues to echo long after the lights fade, not as a shout, but as a quiet, enduring presence.